Even in the kindest possible parallel universe, Heroes of Wrestling was never going to work. It was a nostalgia show promoted at a time when there was zero appetite for the good old days. Better, hotter, more vital days were here as the Monday Night Wars continued to rage. 7 days before the show aired, Vince Russo and Ed Ferrara had signed with WCW in what was considered a shrewd, even debilitating move. If WCW couldn't sink any lower, it was thought that the man whose transformative vision for pro wrestling ushered in the boom was their only hope. They didn't have a Steve Austin nor a functioning bloody brain between them, but honest to God, bro, people thought he was the savior.
Adam Wilborn, I don't know you from Adam. I've never heard of you, which tells me you have zero credentials.
The WWF, meanwhile, was on fire, with The Rock primed to take over from an injured Austin as the company's top face. ECW had waned quite badly, but looking back on things, given how the emergence of AEW has thoroughly diminished the old distant number 2 promotions, Paul Heyman did a remarkable job of holding on for as long as he did. All of which is to state that a good Heroes of Wrestling show, a fun overachiever, stood as much chance of becoming the series it was projected to be as Road Dogg does of successfully deworming his brain. It wasn't a fun show. It did not overachieve. It very narrowly beats out an episode of Monday Night Raw from 3 weeks ago as the single worst professional wrestling show ever promoted. I'm Adam Wilborn from What Culture, and this is the true story behind the worst wrestling show in history. Promoted by human last round quiz answer Bill Stone, he had no access to the premier in-ring talent of the day. This is grim as balls, but then so was the show. He only had access to the ancient and the damned, and he built a celebration of yesteryear around them accordingly. Only the innovative sensation that was Too Cold Scorpio and his opponent didn't fit in, but his prime had sadly also deserted him. Only his prime had deserted him just a few more years prior, whilst virtually everybody else booked on that show was an arthritic relic from the 1980s. You may have heard of its legend. You might wish to compare it to something like The Room or BJ Snowden's In Canada, a so bad it's good cultural artifact with a certain idiosyncratic charm, and watch it just once as a kind of rite of passage to see just how bad it actually is. Heroes of Wrestling, however, is not remotely endearing. It is a dingy, depressing hellscape, the site of a controversial public breakdown, worked across the board by out of shape and or troubled old men. The show started with a histrionic and fairly optimistic video package in which it was claimed that we were finally set for the resolution of so many long-standing pro wrestling rivalries. They had to sell the show, obviously. This rank carny sell job was kind of the least offensive part of it. The production bordered on the harrowing. For what was pitched as an echo of patriotic 80s glamour, the whole thing was absolutely drenched in darkness. Barely lit, the black ring ropes and black ring curtains created an aesthetic not unlike that of an NXT takeover. The wrestling was antithetical to the brilliance that has unfolded on that stage, though Greg Valentine didn't pull a certain can't believe he kicked out face whilst looking despondently his hands, so the show earns an extra quarter star in hindsight. Heroes of Wrestling opened with Samu and the Samoan Savage emerging victorious over Tommy Rogers and Marty Jannetty. This match wasn't hot. It sank like a corpse in the Chattanooga River, or was burnt to a crisp, or whatever fanciful bullshit that madman is spouting these days in a bid to stay relevant. Riddled with passe babyface tropes, the crowd couldn't have given less of a toss about the oldest and easiest trick. Greg Valentine, wearing a blank non-expression, made an immediate beeline to sensational Sherry at the start of his match with George the Animal Steel. The idea was that she was his and he was going to get her. It was otherwise an unwatchable nothing match. Valentine spent longer on the outside than the lead singer of fucking Stained, and of course, Sherry was the Jezebel all along in the one narrative thread that bound Heroes of Wrestling to the wrestling of the day. Julio Fantastico versus Too Cold Scorpio was next. A botch-ridden shoulder shrug was nonetheless kind of a match of the year contender in contrast to the atrocity that followed it. The Bushwhackers versus Nikolai Volkov and the Iron Sheik bears the distinction of being the lowest rated match in the history of the Wrestling Observer newsletter. Dave Meltzer rated it, hilariously, as minus 459 0.4, aka absolute zero. Prior to the opening bell, the Sheik exercised with his Persian club meals. He was better off jamming them into his legs and using them for cartilage, if I'm honest. The man was immobile, and Volkov wasn't much better. He worked a heat spot with Bushwhacker Butch early, but he didn't so much drive his knees into the back as kind of nudge an old and tender pet just to check if it was still alive. The Sheik could enter the ring to make saves, but he could not leave on his own feet. So after a falling tree bump, he crawled outside of the ring on his hands and belly. It was a pathetic, sad sight. To compensate for his shortcomings during one double-team heat spot, Butch, in his plea to the referee, had to wind his fist up like a broken sodding toy, waiting for Sheik to get his deeds over with. A blackballed Tully Blanchard, and this isn't snark for once, cut a better, more beautifully ferocious promo than anything heard on Raw this year. But his match too was a sad, enervated affair. The fire in his belly couldn't make up for the dust in his knees. One-man gang and Abdullah the Butcher made each other bleed in slow motion like a pair of cheese graters rubbing up against one another on an airport conveyor belt, and the crowd, wowed by the claret, actually reacted to that one, but Jimmy Snuka immediately killed them dead in his match with Bob Orton Jr. It was another beyond tedious effort that had graduated uni and had kids by the time it was over. And then the double main event became, in an impromptu scramble, a tag team match because a pissed out of his skull Jake Roberts couldn't do a goddamn thing. He couldn't stand up straight. Playing with his hair and clenching his eyes shut to stave off nausea, Roberts commenced his infamous speech, "You don't want to play cards with me, because I'll cheat," he said. A slurred, inexplicable mixing of metaphors. Roberts was, to be cruel but to be accurate, a drunk talking a load of bollocks. Roberts was pitiable too, of course, but it was difficult to feel too much sympathy, especially when you saw the acts he inflicted on his snake. Stone combined Jim Neidhart versus Jake Roberts and King Kong Bundy versus Yokozuna into one match far sooner than he had attended with the original angle. It featured an aging, effectively unconscious alcoholic relapsing in real time, a grotesquely overweight man, and two well past their prime workers trying to pull something together under the most disastrous and upsetting of circumstances. It was still exponentially better than that Iron Sheik match, though. What happened ultimately is that wrestling got hot and an aspirational but utterly hapless Carney tried to capitalize on the trend. He was worked by those that the national promotions wanted nothing to do with. Neidhart refused to do a job 30 minutes before the show started, and in a moment of poetry, he was bit by the snake he tried to rescue. This was fated to be a depressing anti-punchline by everybody involved. Heroes of Wrestling drew 2,300 largely disinterested punters to Casino Magic in St. Louis, once a proud territory in a rather depressing postscript, and just 29,000 on pay-per-view, failing to break even through the hoped-for 41,000 buys. There was never a Heroes of Wrestling 2, as was intended. The Sheik's kneecaps and the entire wrestling world were thankful. And there you have it, the true story behind the worst pro wrestling show in history. What do you reckon? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And subscribe to What Culture Wrestling on either iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast from. But for now, I've been Adam from What Culture. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.